The air above Lake Seraphim always possessed a singular quality, a heavy, ancient stillness that swallowed sound, leaving the world mute and pressurized. For Elias Thorne, who was 11 years old and knew the suffocating silence of institutional life at St. Jude's Orphanage, the lake was less a boundary and more a reflection of his own isolation. It lay black and flat, mirroring the high, indifferent autumn sky. Elias sat beneath the gnarled roots of a weeping willow, the scratchy wool of his thin institutional sweater doing little to ward off the encroaching chill that always seemed to rise from the water's surface. He was small for his age, with eyes perpetually wide, colored the shifting grey of lake silt, eyes that habitually sought minute details, trained by necessity to watch for danger or opportunity. His inventory was sparse, a single worn pocket knife given to him by a kindly kitchen hand before the man was dismissed, and more recently, a small leather-bound book he had found half buried in the mud near the northern inlet 3 days prior. The book was not a story nor a ledger, but a meticulously kept journal, its pages filled with elegant sloping script and dense technical sketches. He pulled the journal from the inner pocket of his coat. The binding cracked softly, releasing a dry, woody scent mixed with the distinct aroma of decades of lake water and mildew. The script detailed coordinates, pressure tolerances, and most disturbingly, vague clinical references to the subject and the Seraphim submersible research facility. Elias traced a diagram with a dirt-caked finger. It depicted an access point, submerged near the old condemned boathouse, a structure the orphans were forbidden to approach, whispered to be unsound, dangerous, cursed. He had always noticed the subtle, artificial alignment of the pilings there. They did not seem to belong to the rustic decay of the boathouse itself. They looked purposeful, anchored deep into the muddy floor. Tonight, the moon was occluded, muffled by a pervasive layer of high cloud, casting the world into a velvety, impenetrable darkness. This was the moment of opportunity. The night supervisor, Mrs. Hemlock, possessed a deep, unwavering devotion to her evening tea and the silence of the old radio. The journey from the rear laundry entrance of the orphanage to the North Shore took 19 minutes, calculated and executed with practiced economy of movement. The fallen leaves were wet, slicking the path, but Elias moved lightly, his institutional boots barely disturbing the undergrowth. He reached the boathouse. It was a skeletal ruin of blackened timber, listing badly toward the water. The air here was colder, the silence deeper, as if the lake itself held its breath. He drew the flashlight from his coat pocket, a heavy metal cylinder he had liberated from the orphanage maintenance closet. Its beam, activated with a stiff metallic click, was thin and sickly yellow, pushing back against the oppressive darkness only weakly. The journal had indicated the access point lay precisely 7 meters from the third piling supporting the eastern corner of the boathouse. He aimed the beam downward, scanning the disturbed water near the foundation. The water was unnervingly clear close to the edge, but rapidly turned to black, opaque density just a meter out. He saw it then. Not an opening, but a seam. Just beneath the surface, where the lake floor sloped rapidly away, a slab of dark, smooth concrete was visible, contrasting sharply with the natural stones and mud. A faint outline, almost imperceptible, suggested a hatch, a hidden door designed to blend seamlessly with the environment when submerged. Elias knelt at the edge of the collapsing wooden dock. The water licked cold and eager at his hands. The journal mentioned a pressure plate activation system, triggered by displacement weight on the adjacent submerged metal frame. He would have to go in. Removing his heavy coat and boots, he left them neatly stacked on the rotting planks, a small monument to his intention to return. The thin fabric of his shirt and trousers offered no comfort against the shock of the air. He slipped into the water, The cold was immediate and violent. It seized his chest, driving the air from his lungs in a panicked gasp that threatened to betray his presence. He forced himself under, allowing the immense crushing pressure of the deep water to settle over him. It was a physical weight, pressing against his eardrums and temples. The flashlight beam, refracted by the murky water, became a hazy, indistinct cone. He swam toward the concrete slab, following the guidance of the slick metal supports. His small body, accustomed to the minimal rations of the orphanage, felt weightless yet desperately slow in the water. He reached the designated area. His fingers, already numb, sought the texture described in the journal, a thick, ridged lip of steel adjacent to the concrete panel. He pressed against it, leaning his weight against the hidden lever, struggling to apply enough force with his waterlogged body. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through the water, a deep, mechanical sigh that Elias felt more in his sternum than heard with his ears. Slowly, agonizingly, the concrete slab began to move. It did not swing open. It descended, sinking vertically into the lakebed, displacing a great, slow cloud of silt and fine detritus. The opening revealed was a square maw of absolute blackness, framed by thick, rusted iron. The transition from the lake's natural, frigid environment to this entry point was jarring. The water inside the shaft was strangely still, possessing a uniform temperature that was marginally less brutal than the lake itself. Elias hesitated for a long, shuddering moment at the threshold. The darkness ahead felt not merely absent of light, but actively consuming it. He plunged into the shaft, kicking off the lip of the entryway. He aimed the flashlight down. The beam caught the glint of wet metal rungs fixed vertically into the wall, a ladder descending into the depths. He grabbed the first rung. The cold steel bit into his wet hands, and he began the slow, vertical descent. The sound of his labored breathing echoed strangely in the enclosed space, sounding thin and fragile. The shaft was long. He counted 35 rungs before his foot found a solid floor beneath the waterline. The water here was only knee-deep, swirling sluggishly around his shins. He stepped off the ladder, finding himself in a small, damp antechamber constructed entirely of riveted steel. The air, trapped and pressurized, smelled sharply of ozone, chlorine, and damp concrete. The smell of abandoned science. He found the light switch immediately, positioned low on the wall, marked by a faded phosphorescent arrow. He flipped the switch. A low, sputtering buzz erupted overhead, followed by the hesitant, flickering ignition of a series of industrial fluorescent tubes. The chamber was bathed in a stark, unforgiving white light, revealing the severity of the environment. This was clearly a decontamination area, meant to be flooded or pressurized. Against the far wall, a heavy, circular hatch dominated the space, the entryway to the facility proper. It possessed a wheel roughly the size of a dinner plate. Elias approached the hatch. His reflection in the polished steel was distorted, appearing stretched and spectral. He grasped the wheel. It was stiff, protesting years of disuse with a sound like grinding stone, but it moved under the steady application of his slight weight. The sound was deafeningly loud in the confined space, a high-pitched shriek of metal on metal. He finished turning the wheel, hearing the definitive click of the locking bolts disengaging. He pulled the hatch inward. The atmosphere on the other side was drier, significantly warmer, and utterly silent. He stepped through, leaving a trail of dripping water on the checkered steel floor. He was in a sterile corridor, the Seraphim submersible research facility. The passage stretched ahead, a monotonous tunnel of pale, institutional green paint peeling in long, brittle strips. Cables encased in thick rubber sleeves ran along the ceiling, dipping slightly in the middle, suggesting the weight of ancient infrastructure. Elias moved slowly, flashlight clutched tight, though the corridor lights provided just enough visibility. He was walking into a place where time had not merely stopped, but had been actively banished. He checked the journal again. The rough map indicated that the main research area, labeled only as Containment Delta, was at the end of the central spine. He walked past empty rooms, laboratories stripped bare, save for permanent fixtures, fume hoods stained with long-gone chemicals, cold steel counters scored by unseen instruments, and empty racks where test tubes once waited. Each door was labeled with a heavy, stylized stencil: chemistry, electrical, data archive. The silence of the facility was profound. It felt manufactured, designed to absorb and suppress any sound that might emanate from the forbidden depths. He came to the final section of the corridor. The walls here were thicker, reinforced with steel plates bolted across the original structure. The air temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically, suggesting a massive cooling system was either running or failing spectacularly nearby. The door at the end was unlike the others. It was massive, insulated, sealed with a thick rubber gasket, possessing no handle on the outside, only a card reader slot that glowed with a faint, unresponsive red light. Elias searched the immediate area, running his hands along the dusty counter of a console adjacent to the door. He felt a small, cold object tucked beneath the lip of the console. It was a key card, heavy and laminated, bearing no inscription save for the single, stark label, Access Delta. He hesitated, his heart now hammering against his ribs, the rhythm loud and frantic in the unnatural quiet. This felt less like discovery and more like an intrusion into something profoundly private and dangerous. He inserted the card into the slot. The red light vanished, replaced by a momentary flash of brilliant green. A hydraulic hiss, long and deep, emanated from the doorframe. The door did not swing. It began to glide sideways, withdrawing into the thick wall with a low, grinding rumble. The chamber beyond was vast, cold, and dominated by a terrible, breathtaking structure. Elias stepped across the threshold, feeling the sudden, dramatic shift in air density. The room was perhaps 20 meters wide, its high ceiling crisscrossed with thick pipes and ventilation shafts. The light sources here were powerful halogen arrays, casting the chamber in a brilliant, almost blinding clinical illumination. And in the center of that light, rising from the floor almost to the ceiling, was the object of the entire facility, a massive, cylindrical containment vat. The vat was constructed of thick, reinforced glass, slightly tinted a pale amber, and filled completely with a clear, shimmering liquid that caught the halogen light and diffused it into an ethereal glow. Elias approached the edge of the containment unit slowly, his wet shoes squeaking on the pristine steel floor. He felt a rising nausea, a profound sense of wrongness that transcended the physical cold. He looked inside the vat. The liquid was viscous and perfectly still. It held a figure, suspended motionless, perfectly preserved in the clear solution. The figure was small. It was a child. Elias raised his flashlight. Though the ambient light was sufficient, he aimed the beam at the figure's face. The world dissolved into a silent, catastrophic roar inside Elias's skull. The figure inside the containment unit was him. Every detail, every minute inflection of his own face was replicated with unnerving fidelity. The same small scar above the left eyebrow, acquired during a tumble from the apple tree at St. Jude's last spring. The same slight tilt to the nose. The same precise shade of lank, dark hair floating gently around the head, suspended by the buoyancy of the fluid. The eyes of the figure were closed, peaceful, eternally still, but the form, the shape, the dimensions, the identity was undeniably and impossibly his own. Elias stood there, utterly paralyzed, his breath suspended, refusing to inhale the air of this horrifying place. His entire understanding of self, of origin, of reality, was dissolving into the chilling clarity of the glass vat. The shock was not a sudden burst of panic. It was a deep, pervasive coldness that settled deep into his bones, rendering him immobile and purely observant. He stared at the face of the thing floating inches from his own, separated only by the thick pane of glass and the shimmering solution. That is me. But if that was him, perfectly preserved and suspended in time, then what was he? He pressed his hand against the cold glass. It transmitted the terrible chill directly into his palm. He could see the intricate network of tubes entering the vat, connected to powerful pumps and regulators marked with cryptic symbols. The environment was meticulously maintained. The figure inside was nude, utterly vulnerable, a specimen held for observation. The skin was pale, almost translucent, luminous in the specialized light. Elias found himself circling the vat, not in search of an escape, but in a desperate, frantic need for proof, for context, for any rational explanation that could mend the fracturing reality he inhabited. He noticed a small, recessed panel set into the steel wall directly behind the vat. It was secured by a simple digital lock. Driven by a terrible urgency, the need to know eclipsing the fear of discovery, Elias returned to the console near the entrance. He scanned the surface, seeking the numerical key. He found a piece of yellowed masking tape stuck to the underside of the keyboard, bearing a single 4-digit number, sloppily written 2007. He returned to the panel and entered the code. The lock gave a soft beep, and the panel clicked open, revealing a meticulously organized archive of physical files and digital storage drives. He pulled out the thickest folder, bound in heavy cardstock, labeled simply Subject 01E Thorne. His hands were shaking so violently that the papers rattled. He laid the folder on a nearby metal surface and began to read the formal, precise, emotionally barren language of institutional documentation. The documents dated back 12 years, 2 years before his own conscious memories began at St. Jude's. The initial reports detailed a highly experimental, covert project focusing on synthetic biological transfer and expedited maturation. The goal, couched in clinical terms, was the creation of a baseline biological duplicate capable of receiving and retaining complex neurological imprinting. Elias, the Elias who was reading, felt a dizzying pressure behind his eyes. He scanned for the critical entry. He found a section labeled Incident 0. It detailed the catastrophic failure of the initial conditioning phase. The subject, designated 01E, had experienced severe neural shock during the attempted transfer of complex memory structures. The transfer had been incomplete, resulting in a sudden, critical physiological collapse. The scientists, unable to stabilize the original subject, had been forced to make a terrible, quick decision. They had initiated the secondary protocol. Elias's eyes fixed on the dense paragraph describing the protocol. It explained that a viable, accelerated clone, a reserve cultivated in the adjacent chamber, had been required for immediate deployment. Deployment. The word felt cold, military, and utterly dehumanizing. The archive stated that the reserve clone had been stabilized and successfully imprinted with rudimentary generalized memory patterns, a synthetic childhood up to age 3, and then was subtly introduced into a neutral, low-risk environment, the system of the local orphanage, St. Jude's. The objective was simple: allow the reserve subject to mature naturally, stabilizing its advanced biology outside the confines of the lab, while the original subject, 01E, was preserved indefinitely in stasis, pending further technological advances for revival or analysis. Elias, the boy standing on the cold steel floor, was the reserve clone. He was the deployment. He was the secondary subject. The figure floating in the vat, sealed and suspended in the amber fluid, was the original Elias Thorne. The revelation was not just a shock, it was an annihilation of identity. He was not a boy who had lost his parents. He was a project that had been misplaced. His memories, his feelings, the quiet dread he carried, were they truly his, or merely the synthetic scaffolding built to keep a backup model functional? He stumbled back, knocking a stool over. The clang echoed violently off the steel walls. Tears, sudden and involuntary, streamed down his face, cold against the lingering dampness of the lake water. They were tears of existential grief, mourning a self that never truly was. He moved back to the vat, his fingers now clawing at the glass, seeking some tangible connection to the lost original. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking, strained by disuse and despair. "You were supposed to be me." The stillness of the original Elias was terrifying. He looked entirely peaceful, unburdened by the chaos of identity, floating in the gentle, perpetual twilight of the chemical solution. Elias returned to the files, needing more granular detail, needing to understand why he existed at all. The documents revealed a tragicomic level of desperation. The research had been funded by a highly private, wealthy foundation obsessed with achieving functional immortality for key individuals, people whose specific genius or knowledge was deemed too valuable to lose. The initial subject, the true Elias, had been the child of two prominent researchers at the facility, volunteered for the groundbreaking experiment. Elias found a small, personal diary tucked into a hidden compartment in the archive, bound in plain blue cloth. It was the personal log of Dr. Alistair Kane, one of the lead scientists, written in a hand that occasionally trembled. The entries were agonizingly human. They spoke of the deep guilt and crushing despair following the failure of Subject 01E. October 14th. The reserve is stable. We cannot call him a clone. He is a second iteration, a hollow vessel temporarily filled with the necessary scaffolding of memory. His origin is sterile, but his life must not be. He deserves a chance at genuine existence outside of this terrifying purpose. We introduced him to the mundane. He will be safe there. He will believe he is real. November 2nd. I visit St. Jude's under the guise of philanthropy. The boy, Elias, is small, quiet. He watches the water. He has developed a singular attachment to Lake Seraphim. Perhaps a residual instinct, a pull toward his origin. I pray he never finds the truth. The burden of knowing he is secondary, a replacement, is too heavy for any child. The words were a brutal confession, a final act of human sympathy in a place defined by cold mechanics. Elias sat on the cold floor, the thin blue diary clutched to his chest. He was not just a clone. He was a secret kept by the dying guilt of a broken scientist. His escape, his connection to the lake, his very sense of longing, all of it rooted in the very structure he had sought to escape. He looked up at the original Elias, floating serenely above him. The true subject was suspended in failure, while the reserve, the deployment, was alive, breathing the sterile air of the consequence. The implications were staggering. If he was a copy, a reserve, did he have a soul? Did his pain, his hopes for adoption, his friendships, however fleeting at the orphanage, truly matter, or were they merely successful, calculated simulations? He knew with a sudden, crushing certainty that he could not leave the original Elias here. The act felt like abandoning his own origin, leaving the core of his identity entombed in glass and chemicals. But what could he do? He was a small 11-year-old boy in an abandoned, highly specialized laboratory beneath a vast, cold lake. He looked around the chamber, his eyes desperately scanning for any functional instrument. He noticed a maintenance panel on the base of the vat, secured by heavy wing nuts. He retrieved his pocket knife. It was small, its blade thin and somewhat dull, but it was steel. It was the only tool he possessed. He approached the base of the vat and began working on the heavy metal fasteners. The wing nuts were rusted, requiring immense strain. His arms ached, his fingers slipped, raw, and scraped against the cold metal. Each agonizing turn produced a screech that felt magnified tenfold by the emptiness of the facility. He worked for what felt like hours, focused entirely on the rhythmic application of pressure, drowning out the catastrophic implications of his discovery. He focused on the physical resistance, treating the wingnuts as symbols of the barrier between his fractured self and the possibility of integrity. Inside, a tangle of hoses, pressure gauges, and brightly colored wires was revealed. Dominating the small space was a large red emergency handle, clearly labeled decompression drain. Dr. Kane's journal entry echoed in his mind, preserved indefinitely in stasis. To drain the fluid would be to violate the stasis, to expose the fragile original subject to the harsh, dry air, the irreversible environment of decay. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold steel of the handle. To drain the vat was to choose one identity over the other, or perhaps to finally bring the original to a resting place, releasing him from his sterile prison. He looked into the vat again. The floating figure seemed to regard him with silent, eternal judgment. "I am alive," Elias thought, a fierce internal declaration. "I am here. I feel. I hurt." The existence of the original was a perpetual shadow, a constant reminder that he was derivative. He could not live fully while his true source remained suspended, waiting, challenging his claim on reality. He gripped the handle. It was heavy, resistant, cold. He pulled. The movement was abrupt and decisive. A deafening mechanical groan erupted from the machinery. Immediately, the smooth, clear liquid began to drain rapidly from the bottom of the vat. The sound was phenomenal. A rushing torrent of fluid being sucked down into the sub-levels of the facility, roaring through the pipes. Elias stepped back, watching the amber solution level drop with alarming speed. As the liquid descended, the figure of the original, Elias, began to settle, slowly descending until his feet touched the solid floor of the vat. The suspension was gone. The fluid level passed the torso, exposing the skin to the dry air. The peaceful, preserved appearance began to change immediately. The skin, having been maintained in perfect conditions, reacted violently to the change in pressure and environment. It lost its translucent glow, becoming dull, grayish. Elias watched, horrified, as the truth of his action became manifest. He was not rescuing the original, he was releasing him into the inevitability of decay. The chamber began to fill with the sterile chemical odor of the draining fluid, a sharp metallic tang that burned the back of Elias's throat. When the last of the liquid had vanished, the glass cylinder was empty, save for the slight limp form of the original Elias, slumped against the bottom, his head resting against the curve of the glass. He looked utterly lifeless, profoundly and tragically unreal. Elias approached the vat again, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. The sense of urgency had faded, replaced by a terrible, quiet sorrow. He had expected a dramatic revelation, a magical truth that would make him whole. Instead, he had only found a deep, irreparable wound. He had found death, and in doing so, he had confirmed his own life. He looked at the features of the original, features that were his own. He looked at the face that for 12 years had been the ghost haunting his reality. "I am sorry," Elias whispered, the words echoing thinly in the vast, emptying chamber. "I didn't know how to live while you were waiting." He knew he could not stay. The draining process was too loud, too final. The entire facility felt as if it were mourning, its purpose abruptly ended. He had to reverse his steps, return to the harsh, undeniable reality of St. Jude's and the life he had been given. He turned from the vat, leaving the original Elias Thorne to the silence of the abandoned research facility. He did not look back. He had looked enough. He retrieved the blue diary of Dr. Kane. The truth of his origin was too important to leave behind, too painful to forget. He walked back through the sterile corridors. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer now, their hum more desperate. He reached the heavy steel hatch and cranked the wheel, sealing the containment chamber and its heartbreaking contents behind him. The grinding of the metal was a final punctuation mark on the trauma. He passed through the damp antechamber, stepping back into the chilling, knee-deep water. He began the ascent up the vertical ladder. The 40 rungs were wet, slick, and treacherous. When he reached the top, he paused beneath the lake surface, fighting for breath. The water above him was black and endless. He pushed the access panel mechanism again, triggering the slow, powerful mechanism that raised the concrete slab, sealing the facility beneath. The water swallowed the sound, leaving only the soft lapping of the lake against the old dock. Elias pulled himself onto the rotting planks. The cold air, though less severe than the water, made him shiver uncontrollably, a violent, rattling tremor that shook his entire body. He grabbed his coat and boots, pulling the damp cloth over his frozen skin. The physical pain was grounding, a fierce reminder that he was flesh and blood, subject to cold and hunger. He walked away from the dock, away from the lake. The journal of the facility discarded, the pocket knife secured, the blue diary tucked close to his chest. The journey back to St. Jude's was different. The world was no longer merely indifferent. It was layered with a profound, hidden history that belonged solely to him. He was back in his sparse, cot-filled dormitory before the first hint of grey light touched the eastern horizon. He slipped beneath the thin, scratchy blanket, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He did not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the shallow, rhythmic breathing of the 30 other boys around him. All real, all originals, perhaps. He was the anomaly. The immediate consequence of the discovery was a crippling internal silence. He could not speak the truth. It was a truth too vast, too impossible for the world he inhabited. He had to carry the knowledge of the Seraphim submersible research facility and the still preserved figure within it entirely alone. The next morning, the ritual of the orphanage resumed. The thin, watery oatmeal, the enforced quiet of the dining hall, the mundane lessons on geography and sums. Elias performed his role, moving through the motions of the boy he was supposed to be, the quiet, small orphan. But internally, everything had shifted. His perceptions were heightened, sharpened by the raw trauma of the night. Every time a careless older boy bumped him in the hall, he felt a sharp, almost aggressive need to assert his presence. I am here. I am solid. I am real. The emotional weight was suffocating. He realized that the life he lived, the small moments of kindness he cherished, were not accidental. They were the consequence of a desperate human choice made by a guilt-ridden scientist. His vulnerability was not simply the nature of being an orphan, it was the nature of being a replacement. Days turned into a week. The physical evidence was gone, hidden beneath the unmoving surface of Lake Seraphim. Only the blue diary remained, hidden deep beneath the floorboards of his cot, a constant, heavy reminder. Elias began to spend his few hours of solitude near the lake again, but he stayed far from the boathouse. He would simply stare at the water, reflecting on the vast, liquid mausoleum beneath. He knew that the scientists, whoever they were, would eventually realize the facility had been drained. The power consumption logs, the temperature monitors, something would trigger an alert. They would come looking for answers, and perhaps they would come looking for the reserve subject. The dramatic intensity of his situation began to coalesce into a singular focus: self-preservation. He could not run. He was too small, too young, too unconnected. His only refuge was to become utterly unremarkable, to blend into the grey neutrality of the orphanage until he was old enough to vanish completely. The emotional burden of this forced anonymity was immense. He had to bury the shock, the grief, and the existential terror beneath a facade of dull compliance. He became an expert in stillness, in answering with monosyllables, in moving like a shadow. One cold afternoon, Mrs. Hemlock caught him staring vacantly out the window during mandatory study time. "Elias," she rasped, her voice dry and brittle, "you are dreaming again. Focus on your arithmetic. The world does not reward idleness." Elias looked at her, his expression carefully blank. He saw not a rigid matron, but a person living a simple, singular life, a luxury denied to him. "Yes, Mrs. Hemlock," he said, his voice level and without inflection. He returned to the numbers, but his mind was calculating far heavier sums. He was weighing the value of his existence against the cost of its creation. He understood, finally, the depth of Dr. Kane's guilt. The scientist wanted the reserve clone to live a genuine existence. A genuine existence meant acknowledging the pain, absorbing the trauma, and making a choice about who he would be, regardless of the figure in the tank. His life was a gift stolen from oblivion. It was time to claim it. This process of emotional processing was slow, agonizing. It involved confronting the painful truth that every memory, every small comfort he possessed, was tainted by the knowledge of the experiment. He found himself fixating on a specific, simple memory. The way the sunlight filtered through the dust motes in the library, making the air seem thick and golden one quiet afternoon when he was 8. He remembered the feeling of peace that moment had given him. Was that memory real or imprinted? It didn't matter. He was the one remembering it. He was the one experiencing the light, the peace, the dust. The experience belonged to him, the consciousness currently residing in this fragile second iteration body. He began to redefine real. Real was not defined by origin, but by duration and depth of feeling. He had endured 11 years of fear, isolation, and quiet hope. That endurance was undeniably his. The lake, once a symbol of escape, now became a monument to his terrifying liberation. He had faced his genesis, and he had chosen himself over the phantom. The trauma remained, sharp and immediate, but the urgency began to shift from terror to defiance. He started small. He asked questions in class, not defiant questions, but intellectually curious ones, something the quiet, ghost-like Elias had never done before. He began to engage with the world he was placed in. If he was a deployment, then he would deploy himself fully. The climax of his internal struggle occurred late one night, a week later. He lay awake, the blue diary in his hand, rereading the cold, final description of the original subject. Non-viable for complex neural function, maintained only for morphological stability. The original Elias was a shell, a biological statue of failure. Elias, the reserve, pressed the diary against his chest. He closed his eyes and conjured the image of the floating figure. Instead of fear, he felt a profound, aching pity. The true, tragic figure was the one preserved in silence, forever denied the cold air, the biting wind, the sound of the rain, the scratchy wool of the institutional sweater. "I'm experiencing this," Elias realized. "I am the one who gets to be cold. I am the one who gets to endure." The acceptance was a quiet, internal flood, not of peace, but of profound, melancholic resolution. He accepted that his life was derivative, but that his identity was unique, forged in the fires of survival at St. Jude's and cemented by the terrible truth beneath Lake Seraphim. He got out of bed, careful not to wake the others. He retrieved the shovel from the laundry room. An object he now understood was infinitely more valuable than any archived file. He walked past the back entrance, heading away from the lake, toward the dense, overgrown border of the property where the old fence posts had long since rotted away. He stopped beneath the oldest oak tree, its branches skeletal against the night sky. He dug a deep, narrow hole in the cold, resistant earth. The physical labor was cathartic, demanding his attention, grounding him in the simple, undeniable reality of muscle and soil. When the hole was deep enough, He placed the blue diary of Dr. Kane into the earth. It contained the terrible confession, the map to his origins, the proof of his replacement status. He did not need the proof anymore. The truth was etched into his marrow. He covered the book with dirt, packing the earth tightly with the shovel blade. He smoothed the surface, leaving no trace of the disturbed soil. He buried the secret not to forget it, but to stop letting it define him entirely. The memory of the lab, of the figure in the tank would remain, a profound sorrow carried privately. But the physical anchor was gone. He was Elias Thorne, not Subject 01E nor the reserve clone, just Elias. He returned the shovel, washed his hands, and went back to his cot. He lay there, watching the black window square turn a soft, forgiving grey as dawn approached. He felt the cold, hard certainty of his grave consequences, but he also felt the fierce, exhilarating urgency of his life. He was vulnerable, deeply scarred, but entirely and uniquely real. The orphan, having found his impossible truth beneath the lake, chose to live in the difficult, honest light of a borrowed, yet completely claimed, reality. The stillness of the lake no longer represented his isolation. It represented the deep, quiet foundation of the person he was now beginning to become. He would carry the ghost of the original, but he would walk forward into the cold, unpredictable world of genuine existence.